She had always known that voices carried weight, some lifting others up, others pressing them down. But she never imagined that her own voice, the very thing she had learned to hide, would one day become the flashpoint of a moment no one on that base would ever forget. It began quietly, almost innocently, on a morning that should have passed without notice. But fate rarely announces itself. Instead, it creeps in through small moments, a door closing, a sideways glance, a careless insult. And for her, it began with the echo of her own footsteps in a hallway that did not yet feel like it belonged to her. Lina Alvarez had been awake long before the sun rose, nerves twisting through her stomach like coiled wire. It was her third week in basic training at the Northern Military Facility, a vast, cold compound where voices barked commands before dawn and rookies like her learned what discipline felt like on their backs, their feet, and their spirits. For most recruits, it was simply another step toward a career, or a paycheck, or a family tradition. But for Lina, it was something more, a chance to prove she belonged somewhere. A chance to show that the daughter of immigrants, the girl who grew up translating bills and school notices for her parents, could wear the same uniform as anyone born with a simpler path. Her accent had been her first barrier, just a faint trace of the place her family came from, a soft curve in her vowels, a rhythm in her sentences that set her apart. She spoke English fluently, clearly, even confidently when she allowed herself to, but some people didn't hear fluency. They heard foreignness, they heard difference, and difference was something this place had a way of magnifying. As she crossed the yard toward the training hall, she kept her head down, her breath clouding in the early morning cold. The other recruits clustered in small groups, laughing, adjusting their gear, making last-minute jokes before another grueling day. She heard fragments of conversation, sports, home, petty drama, complaints about drills. No one spoke to her. They weren't cruel, not directly, but silence can isolate just as effectively as words. She had learned to read those silences as clearly as sentences. She had always been, in one way or another, the outsider. The day's assignment was posted on a board outside the briefing room. Her eyes scanned the list. Her heart tightened. Below the note about weapons testing and protocol assessment, there was an additional task, a language proficiency evaluation, mandatory for anyone who had declared bilingual capability. She had declared it on her intake form without thinking twice. She had spent her whole life translating for others. It felt natural. It felt normal. But she hadn't expected they would actually test her, at least not like this. A knot formed in her throat as she joined the line of recruits filing into the hall. She didn't know what the evaluation would be. A written test, a quick-spoken demonstration. Nothing should have been intimidating, not compared to the physical brutality of daily training. Yet words mattered to her. Words were the battlefield she'd grown up on. Correcting mispronounced English, defending her parents when people pretended not to understand them, navigating a world where the way she spoke was sometimes used as a measure of her worth. When the doors opened, she froze. Standing at the front of the room was General Hawthorne. She had seen him before, towering, strict, the kind of man whose presence made recruits straighten their spines automatically. His face was carved with the permanent sternness of someone who had spent decades in command. He was known for his discipline, his intensity, and though less openly acknowledged, his disdain for unpolished recruits. She had heard rumors from others, that he didn't like immigrants, that he didn't trust accents, that he considered them signs of weakness, barriers, not assets. She had hoped deeply that her paths and his would rarely cross. Now here he was, presiding over the very evaluation she dreaded. Recruits lined up according to the list. Some were being tested in French, others in German, a few languages she didn't even recognize. When the officer beside him called, "Alvarez, Lina," her pulse began pounding so loudly she couldn't hear anything else for a moment. She stepped forward, her boots clicking softly on the concrete. She stood at attention, hands firm, posture rigid, focusing on her breathing, but she could feel the weight of his gaze before she even looked up. It settled on her like a judgment already passed. "So," the general said, his voice deep, commanding, carrying across the entire room, "this is the bilingual recruit." There were no words laced with insult, not directly. But tone alone can slice deeper than any sentence. A ripple of attention shifted toward her. The room, once filled with quiet murmurs and shuffling feet, grew still. "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "What languages?" he asked. "English and Spanish, sir." He raised an eyebrow, not impressed, not curious, but dismissive. "Spanish," he repeated, as if the word itself carried an unpleasant taste. "I see." Her stomach tightened. He turned to one of the officers behind him, who handed him a sheet of paper. She saw the faint lines of printed text, blocks of writing in a language she recognized instantly, but the general didn't hand it to her. Instead, he held it between two fingers, tapping it against his palm as if deciding something. Then he smirked. "So tell me," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "can you actually translate this? Or is your English only good enough for basic instructions?" A few recruits shifted, glancing at each other. Some smothered uncomfortable reactions. Others looked down, unwilling to meet her eyes. Heat crawled up her neck. She inhaled slowly, reminding herself that she had earned her place here. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I can translate it." The general tilted his head. "We'll see." He finally dropped the sheet into her hands. It was meant to overwhelm her. It wasn't just the weight of the document. It was the weight of expectation pressing into her chest. The room watched her in silence as she scanned the page. She could feel their expectations hovering like shadows, some doubting, some hoping, some simply curious. She forced herself to push past the pressure, the weight of eyes, the cruel smirk of the man waiting for her to fail. But before she could begin, the general spoke again. "Take your time," he said. "We wouldn't want your accent to get in the way." A few recruits exhaled small chuckles under their breath, not loud enough to be obvious, but loud enough to cut. Her heart hammered, her throat threatened to tighten, but she wouldn't let it. She lifted her chin, met the general's gaze directly for the first time, and spoke with a steadiness she didn't fully feel inside. "I'm ready." At that moment, something shifted in the room. It wasn't dramatic, but it was subtle, a collective leaning forward, a quiet anticipation. The general didn't expect her confidence. And though he hid it well, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or surprise, or the realization that this wouldn't be the effortless humiliation he had planned. Still, the test had only just begun. As she opened her mouth to start translating the first line, something happened that she couldn't have predicted. A loud metallic clang echoed from the far side of the hall. One of the recruits had dropped a piece of equipment. The sound reverberated off the concrete walls, jolting everyone. She lost her place on the page for a split second, but regained it quickly. Yet the general seized the moment, stepping closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You don't belong here," he murmured. The words were quiet, but they hit with the force of a blow. Her breath trembled, visible only to her. But instead of collapsing inward, something hardened inside her, a resolve she didn't know she possessed. A voice, her own, rose from somewhere deep, steadying her. She looked back at the page, ready to begin again, ready to speak the words aloud. But before she could, the general abruptly straightened, projecting his voice across the room. "Everyone pay close attention," he said. "This should be enlightening." The recruits formed a semicircle around her, some stepping closer, others staying back, all drawn by the tension. Lena felt the pressure building like a physical force, tightening around her ribs, daring her to break. She inhaled, she spoke the first sentence, and in that instant the entire room went silent, not because of her translation, not because of the content of the document, but because of something else entirely, something no one had anticipated, something that would unravel everything they thought they knew about her, about this test, about the general himself. And as she continued, the silence deepened, heavy and consuming, pulling everyone into a moment they would never forget. The first sentence left her lips with a calm she didn't fully understand. Clear, precise, steady. She had spent her entire life navigating moments where one wrong word meant misunderstanding. Here, however, it meant survival in a room waiting for her to stumble. But she didn't, not on that first line, not on the second. Each word flowed from her mouth in a rhythm she had learned from childhood, classrooms, whispered translations for her mother in grocery stores, late-night phone calls helping relatives, the unacknowledged labor of children asked to be bridges between worlds. The recruits around her grew still. It wasn't admiration, not yet. It was the suspension of assumption. They had expected uncertainty, maybe incompetence. Instead, they heard fluency, control, but the general did not react. He stood with arms folded, his face unmoved. He had expected a shaky voice, a timid attempt, a failure disguised as effort, and though she had defied those expectations, he was not the type to concede ground easily. As she continued, something deeper dawned on her. The content of the document held intelligence notes, intercepted messages, references to regions she recognized from news headlines, coded exchanges hinting at something bigger. She translated every phrase meticulously, but her mind processed meaning too, connecting dots she wasn't meant to see. A murmur traveled through the recruits when she explained a complex phrase perfectly. Eyebrows lifted. Someone whispered, "Damn," beneath their breath. The room shifted around her. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, but enough for her to feel it. Yet the general remained unmoved, waiting like a predator for the moment she might falter. The test grew heavier as she moved to the next paragraphs. Technical language increased. Phrasing grew more layered. Sections required careful interpretation. She paused occasionally, not in uncertainty but ensuring clarity. Each pause made the general smirk slightly, claiming victory with every breath she took. But each time she resumed confidently, denying him satisfaction. Minutes passed. Sweat gathered at her temples, not fear but intensity. She felt her pulse against her throat, but her voice never cracked. Instead, it grew steadier, more anchored, as if each sentence solidified the ground beneath her. Then she reached a sentence she recognized instantly, a phrase her mother used, tied to a regional dialect rarely taught outside their community. The military document included it as a coded reference, but she understood it instinctively. She translated flawlessly, her tone softening briefly, colored by memory. The recruit stiffened in surprise. Even the officer beside the general glanced up, caught off guard. General Hawthorne's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, tapping the paper lightly. "You seem practiced," he said coldly. "Did they make you translate at home too?" "Bills, phone calls, school forms. Is that why you think you're qualified to stand here?" His words cut deeper than before, mocking her accent, now mocking her life, her upbringing, the invisible burdens she carried. Something stung behind her eyes, but she refused to blink. "Not here, not now." "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I did translate for my family. It taught me to be precise, fast, accurate. Skills you asked me to demonstrate today." A current shifted in the room, respect from some, discomfort from others. Hawthorne narrowed his eyes. "Continue," he ordered, and she did, unaware of how far this moment would take her. This time, however, she felt something building within her. A pressure, a tension, not fear, not anger, something colder, sharper, clarity. She was no longer performing for them. She was translating for herself now, reclaiming the voice he had tried to diminish. And as she read on, the recruits leaned closer, not wanting to miss a word, but the general wasn't finished. Halfway through the next paragraph, he interrupted. "Wrong," he declared loudly, though she hadn't made a mistake. "That's not the correct phrasing." She froze. Every eye snapped toward her. She looked down at the paper again, scanning the sentence. She knew she'd translated it perfectly. The structure, the grammar, the context, it was all accurate. Yet here he was, calling her wrong without explanation. He wanted a stumble, a crack, something he could latch onto. "I believe it is correct, sir," she replied carefully. The room held its breath. The general stepped closer, towering over her. "Are you correcting me, Recruit Alvarez?" Silence, thick as smoke. No one dared move. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Not correcting, just refusing to be stepped on. She needed to navigate this moment carefully. One wrong reply could destroy her, but one truthful silence could do the same. "I'm suggesting," she said slowly, "that the phrasing depends on interpretation, sir." Hawthorne stared at her, a long, cold, calculated stare. Then, unexpectedly, he turned to the officer beside him. "Is that correct?" The officer swallowed. He looked at the document, he looked at Lena, then back at the general. "Technically, yes, sir. Her translation is accurate." The temperature in the room shifted dramatically. A ripple ran through the recruit's shock, disbelief, a quiet surge of awe. The general's face hardened, though he uttered no response. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared. He looked like a man told his reflection was flawed. For the first time, Lena allowed herself a breath of relief. Small, invisible, but real. The general, however, was not a man easily undermined. If anything, her accuracy fueled something darker within him, a desire to break the narrative she was building. "Fine," he said curtly. "Move to the next section, the coded one." A murmur ran through the room. That portion of the document was known among officers to be complicated, layered references, embedded meaning, phrasing meant for trained linguists. Not recruits, certainly not rookies. The general handed her a second sheet, filled with dense blocks of text and symbols. He handed it to her almost triumphantly. "Let's see if you can handle something more advanced." She lifted the sheet. At first glance, it looked like an impossible maze. But as her eyes traveled across the lines, a realization settled in her stomach. She recognized portions of it, not because she had encountered them before, but because the patterns were similar to coded messages her cousin had once studied during his internship with a border security agency. He had shown her old examples, describing how patterns were used to embed meaning. She didn't know the formal training behind it, but she understood the concept. The general didn't know that. The room waited. Some recruits shook their heads, assuming this would be the breaking point. Others whispered with curiosity. A few leaned forward, watching her closely, not mocking now, but uncertain of what would unfold. Lena inhaled slowly. The edges of her nerves pulsed, but she spoke anyway. Her voice was slower this time, careful, dissecting each phrase. She translated the surface meaning first, the literal words. Then she moved to the implied meaning, the contextual direction embedded in the sequence. Then, finally, she explained the pattern behind the symbols. A hush fell over the room so deep it felt unnatural, because she wasn't just translating, she was interpreting. She was pulling meaning from structures meant to confuse. She was doing what even officers sometimes struggled to do. Around her, recruits exchanged stunned looks. Someone whispered, "How the hell does she know that?" Another muttered, "She's killing it." a third recruit, who had previously laughed under his breath, now stared at her with something like disbelief, maybe even guilt. But the general wasn't stunned. He was furious. His lips pressed into a rigid line, his shoulders straightened. His eyes sharpened, tracking her words like they were threats. Finally, when she reached the halfway point of the coded text, he cut her off sharply. "That's enough." She stopped mid-sentence. The room jolted. The abruptness of his tone carried something unmistakable: fear, but not fear of her. Fear of what her success meant. Fear of losing control of the narrative he had crafted. He stepped forward, voice booming. "You're overstepping, Recruit Alvarez." This exercise was meant to test basic translation ability, not whatever improvisation you think you're qualified for. "It wasn't improvisation," she said before she could stop herself. "It's what the text implies." His face reddened. "You are not here to interpret implication. I'm here to translate accurately," she replied. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but the room heard it like a slap. The recruits watched, breathless. Some eyes widened. Some darted between her and the general, in anticipation of the explosion to come. Even the officers seemed unsure of what would happen next. The general stepped so close she could feel the heat of his anger. "You think that accent of yours makes you special," he said, low enough for only the front row to hear. "You think it makes you useful. It doesn't. It makes you a liability." Her heart twisted, not because his words hurt, they did, but because they were familiar. She had heard versions of them her whole life, in classrooms, in grocery stores, in job interviews, in whispers, in looks, in barriers she hadn't chosen but had been forced to navigate. But she did not look away, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't a child translating documents at a kitchen table. She wasn't a teenager trying to hide the sound of her heritage. She wasn't an outsider apologizing for existing. She was a recruit in uniform. She had earned her place, and he couldn't take that from her. The general drew in a slow breath, preparing to say something more, something crueler, something meant to shatter her will. But before he could, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "Sir, she's right." Every head swung toward the sound. The room froze. Even the general's breath halted, and in that suspended moment, everything began to shift. The voice that spoke from the back of the room didn't belong to a timid recruit or someone easily dismissed. It belonged to Sergeant Mallory, one of the most respected mid-level instructors on the base. A man known not for favoritism or softness, but for fairness, precision, and a reputation of calling things exactly as they were. His tone cut through the air with the authority of someone who had seen too much to let injustice masquerade as discipline. The general turned slowly, his expression darkening. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tight. Mallory stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back, posture unwavering. "I said, sir, she's right. Her translation is accurate, and her interpretation of the coded sequence aligns with protocol." A wave of shock rippled through the recruits. This wasn't just support, it was a direct contradiction of the general's judgment. A challenge. The air thickened instantly, like the room itself understood the danger of what had just been spoken. General Hawthorne's jaw twitched. "Sergeant," he said sharply, "I was not asking for your evaluation." "No, sir," Mallory replied, "but you were conducting one, and protocol states that when a recruit is being assessed, accuracy matters more than ego." The recruits held their breath. Some looked terrified, others seemed electrified. Lena felt the air crackle around her like a storm building silently beyond the horizon. Mallory wasn't defending her out of kindness. This was something else: principle, truth, refusing to let cruelty hide behind authority. The general's eyes narrowed, sharp enough to cut. "Are you questioning my judgment?" "I'm clarifying the facts," Mallory said. "Her work is correct." The general's silence was far worse than shouting. He stared at Mallory with a rigid stillness, then turned slowly back to Lena, not with acceptance, but with something more controlled, more venomous. A man whose pride had been struck. A man searching for another angle, another weakness, another way to regain control of the room. "Fine," he said flatly. "If you're also convinced of her talent, let's continue the evaluation." The word talent dripped with disdain. He held out a final sheet, longer, denser, even more complicated, the kind of document linguists trained months to read comfortably, a task designed not to measure skill but to ensure failure. The recruits stared in disbelief. Even the officers exchanged uneasy glances. Her hands trembled, not visibly, but enough for her to feel the pulsing throb under her skin. She took the page anyway. The general stepped back, arms crossed. "Proceed," she looked at the paper. The text was cluttered, a labyrinth of formal language, coded references, diplomatic phrasing that demanded perfect interpretation. But beneath the complexity, Lena recognized patterns she had seen before in her uncle's old references, in academic articles she read under dim lights, in documents analysts used to decipher meaning buried beneath cultural nuance. She swallowed, clearing her voice. Her translation began slowly, not hesitant but deliberate. The recruits leaned closer again, drawn to the rhythm of her voice. As she continued, her confidence expanded, not dramatically but steadily like a growing flame. Sentence by sentence, the structure unraveled, revealing secrets and strategies. She explained not just the words, but tone, regional implications, cultural coding behind phrasing, things not taught here. Understanding built in layers, her voice weaving through the document like a practiced instrument. Recruits exchanged stunned looks. An officer beside the general blinked at her, impressed. The room felt suspended, held together by the cadence of her narration. She was revealing something deeper. Then halfway through the sheet, she reached a line that made her breath hitch. Something wasn't right, not with translation, but with the document itself. A phrase repeated in the wrong place, a sequence that didn't flow, a line out of context, a mismatch she recognized instantly. This was intentional, a planted error meant to confuse or expose weakness. She scanned it twice, then a third time. Then she made a choice. The next line appears to contain a misplacement, she said. It seems intentionally scrambled. Shock rippled through the room. Officers looked at each other. Hawthorne stiffened. There is no error, he snapped. Her hands no longer trembled. With respect, sir, the structure indicates a pattern, one that breaks here. It doesn't fit with the surrounding lines. Are you suggesting the document is wrong? I'm pointing out what the text shows, she said. If you read this as is, the message is compromised. You are out of line, he barked. Silence. But she didn't back down. She had spent too many years shrinking herself. A fire rose in her ribs. I'm not challenging you, sir, she said. I'm trying to be accurate. His rage simmered. He opened his mouth, but Mallory stepped forward. She's right, he said. It's a standard misdirection tactic, and the entire room shifted. General Hawthorne's face hardened into stone. He stood motionless for a long, tense moment, then turned sharply toward the officers. Leave us, he said. All of you. But Mallory stepped forward. Sir, that's against leave, Hawthorne repeated, voice booming. Officers hesitated. Recruits froze. The command sliced the air cleanly. Slowly, reluctantly, the officers filed out. Recruits followed, uncertain, uneasy. Some glanced back at Lena with worry, others with awe or sympathy. Soon only Lena, the general, and Sergeant Mallory remained. The moment the door closed, the general's posture changed, tight, dangerous, controlled like a storm barely held together. He faced her. You think your little performance proves something, he said quietly, too quietly. Mallory stepped forward. Sir, not now, Hawthorne snapped. Lena's pulse thundered in her ears, but she said nothing. Silence, she had learned, was sometimes more powerful than words. You embarrassed me, Hawthorne said, returning his focus to her. In front of my officers, in front of the recruits, you undermined my authority. He stepped closer, too close. Mallory shifted subtly, aligning himself with her, ready if needed. With respect, Lena said, her voice steady, I only answered the questions. That's what the evaluation required. The general's lips curled. No, what you did was challenge me, correct me, show off. His voice dropped lower, hotter. This base is built on obedience, not theatrics. Mallory tensed. Sir, she did nothing inappropriate, but Hawthorne cut him off with a glare sharp enough to scorch. You think your accent makes you special, the general continued, voice laced with venom. You think speaking 2 languages gives you power. But people like you, people who don't belong here, use language to hide weakness. Lena's chest tightened, his words landing on old wounds formed long before this day. Sir, she whispered, I'm here to serve the same as everyone else. Hawthorne stepped even closer, until she could see the small, rigid movements in his jaw. You serve when I say you serve. You succeed when I allow you to succeed. Remember that? Her hands flexed at her sides. She kept her breath steady. Mallory's eyes flicked between them, reading the danger. People like you, Hawthorne said, leaning in, only rise if someone like me says so. A pause, then slower. You do not rise on your own. Something cracked inside her, not broken, but awakened. She didn't flinch, she didn't break. She simply spoke the truth she had carried through a lifetime of being underestimated. I did rise on my own, she said softly, and that's why you're angry. The silence that followed was electric, sharp, and dangerous. Mallory inhaled sharply. Hawthorne snapped. He slammed his hand onto the table beside her, the sound erupting like a gunshot. Papers flew. Lena didn't flinch. How dare you? But a sudden knock shattered the moment. An officer burst in breathlessly. Sir, urgent intelligence update. Command center needs a translation immediately. Hawthorne growled. Send it to linguistics. They did, sir. They want her. The world stopped. Her heart froze. Mallory exhaled as if seeing fate intervene. Hawthorne blinked once, a crack in his authority. You, move, he snapped, voice trembling with suppressed rage. She followed the officer out. The hallway stretched long and dim, their footsteps echoing. Message came 15 minutes ago, the officer said, walking fast. High-level communication flagged from border surveillance. Linguistics couldn't decode embedded sequences. Someone said they overheard you interpreting patterns. Lena swallowed hard. Everything in her life had prepared her for translation, but never like this. The command center roared with activity, screens glowing, analysts shouting, urgency thick. A large monitor displayed complex coded text, longer and more intricate than the sheets before. Colonel Reeves stepped forward. Older, white hair, steady eyes. "You're the recruit who identified the code displacement." "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Good, we need fresh eyes." He gestured her forward. The room quieted as Lena approached the screen. Her chest tightened. The symbols, the patterns, they called to her, familiar in some deep, instinctive way. She inhaled slowly and began reading. Softly at first, then louder. She peeled back each layer, surface phrasing, hidden meaning, cultural markers, embedded warnings. Analysts leaned in. Reeves scribbled notes. Mallory stood at the back, arms crossed, pride rising in his eyes. The deeper she went, the more her voice strengthened. She explained shifts, patterns, misdirection techniques, things linguists sometimes missed. She revealed timings, infiltration routes, warnings hidden beneath coded fragments. The room grew painfully quiet. When she finished, Reeves stepped forward. "That confirms what we suspected but couldn't prove. You clarified the missing connection points." His eyes locked onto hers. "You may have prevented a breach." Lena's breath shook. I just translated." Reeves shook his head. "No, you understood. That's different." As he turned to relay orders, the command center doors slammed open. Hawthorne stormed in. Officers stiffened. Analysts froze. Reeves continued issuing commands without acknowledging him. When he finished, he finally turned. "General," Hawthorne glared, "why is my recruit interfering with intelligence operations?" "Your recruit," Reeves raised a brow. "She was requested by linguistics. She is untrained." "She is correct," Reeves interrupted sharply. "More accurate than earlier attempts." Silence crashed over the room. Hawthorne's face reddened, lips trembling with fury he could no longer weaponize. "For national security," Reeves said, voice clipped, "we cannot afford to overlook her potential." Hawthorne stuttered but produced no rebuttal. Lena stood silent, hands trembling, not with fear now, but the weight of what she had done. She hadn't meant to embarrass him. She only wanted to prove she belonged. But under the bright lights of the command center, she understood something new. She was needed. Reeves faced her. "Report to my office tomorrow at 800. There may be a program for you, linguistic operations." Her breath hitched. "Yes, sir, I'm interested." Hawthorne turned away, defeated. Mallory stood just behind her, quietly proud. Reeves dismissed her with a nod. "You're free to go." Mallory walked her toward the hallway, the buzz of the command center fading behind them. The adrenaline drained from her body, replaced suddenly by a trembling exhaustion that made her legs feel weak. The corridor felt colder now, quieter, as if the world itself needed a moment to absorb everything that had just happened. Mallory finally spoke. "He won't forget this," he said gently. "Men like Hawthorne don't handle being wrong very well." Lena stared at the floor, the weight of the day settling heavily over her shoulders. "I didn't mean to embarrass him," Lena whispered. "I know," Mallory said. "That's why it hurts him more." She exhaled slowly, leaning back against the wall as if trying to keep herself upright. "Was I foolish? Should I have stayed quiet?" Mallory shook his head firmly. "No, you did what was right, and for what it's worth, we need people like you. Voices like yours, perspectives like yours." His words lingered, sinking deep into places she rarely let anyone see. Later that night, alone in her bunk, she stared at the ceiling, replaying the day, its humiliation, fear, courage, and unexpected triumph. The dorm was quiet, most recruits already asleep, unaware of the storm that had unfolded beyond their walls. But Lena couldn't sleep. Her mind spun with contradictions. Victory tangled with vulnerability, pride shadowed by lingering pain. She thought of her parents, their sacrifices, their broken English, their quiet strength. She thought of the insults they had endured, the dismissive looks, the silent assumptions. She thought of how she had spent years trying to make her accent smaller, her voice quieter, her identity easier for others to accept. And yet today, that same voice had saved lives. And the world, not just the room, had listened. The next morning came too quickly. She dressed quietly, tying her boots with fingers still stiff from the cold. She hadn't seen Hawthorne since the confrontation and half-expected retaliation, a punishment, a reassignment, something meant to reassert control. But when she stepped outside, the air felt different, charged, whispering, watching. As she crossed the yard, recruits glanced at her, some with admiration, some with disbelief, some with resentment. "That's her," she heard someone whisper. "The one who translated the code." Another said, "She corrected the general." The murmurs followed like shadows, and then she saw him, Hawthorne, standing rigid during drills. Their eyes met briefly. His were filled with unspoken resentment, hers with a quiet strength she hadn't realized she possessed. He turned away without a word. That silence told her everything. he knew the truth. He had tried to break her, but she had risen anyway. Later that morning, she reported to Reeves's office. It was warm compared to the frost outside. Maps lined the walls, screens displayed encrypted data, and papers were stacked neatly across his desk. "You have two options," he said plainly. "Return to regular training or pursue early placement into linguistic analysis." "It will be harder," Reeves continued. "Longer hours, greater pressure, higher expectations, but it could lead to a career few recruits ever achieve, and you would be doing work that matters, work you are clearly built for." Lena swallowed. "Sir, I don't know if I'm ready." Reeves leaned forward. "No one is ready at first. The question is whether you are willing." She looked down at her hands, the same hands that translated for her family, that steadied papers under Hawthorne's glare, that carried the weight of her parents' hopes. "I'm willing," she said. Reeves nodded once. "Training begins in 2 days." When she stepped out of his office, a strange sensation washed over her. Relief, pride, lingering pain, quiet triumph, a mixture she had never felt so intensely before but understood instinctively: growth. As she crossed the base, the cold wind brushed her face, sharp and cleansing. She realized something important, something she had never allowed herself to believe. Her voice wasn't a weakness. It was her power. Her accent wasn't a flaw. It was her history. Her story wasn't an obstacle. It was her strength. And for the first time, she didn't try to soften it or hide it. She let it be, she let herself be. Hours later, as the sun dipped behind the hills and long shadows stretched across the compound, she paused outside the barracks, watching the last light fade. She thought of the general, his pride, his prejudice, his fury. She thought of how many others like him existed, building walls with their words. She knew her journey wouldn't get easier. There would be more who doubted her, more who mocked her, more who saw her accent as a threat instead of a gift. But she would rise, again and again, because she had learned something irreversible today. Her voice could silence a room. Her voice could expose truth. Her voice could save lives. And there was nothing a man like Hawthorne could do to change that. When she stepped inside for the night, the hallways felt different. Not warmer, but less hostile, less heavy, as if her presence now held its own weight. She reached her bunk, sat down slowly, and let out a trembling breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. She whispered the words she once feared she might never believe: "I belong here." And for once it didn't feel like a wish. It didn't feel like a hope. It felt like truth. A truth earned through struggle, pain, courage, and a voice she could no longer silence, even if she tried. She rose from her bunk, feeling lighter, stronger, more certain than she had ever felt in her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new expectations, new eyes watching her every move, but she wasn't afraid, not anymore. Because she knew something Hawthorne never understood: some voices rise whether they are welcomed or not, and hers, after everything, was only just beginning.